Anti-Socialism with Chinese characteristic. Many people believe that China is communist. It was never been communist to begin with. It was a state capitalist society that even Mao Zedong himself, in his work on capitalism, has admitted that China is still capitalist and has been state capitalist since the very beginning. A new generation of Western self-described Marxist-Leninists have come to the fore in the last several years, wrapping themselves in the legacy of Mao Zedong. They claim to be the inheritors of the old third international communist parties that dominated the 20th century, and present, at least in their minds, the greatest threat to American world order. But where older generation Marxist-Leninists focused on replacing capitalism, what was understood as the primary driver of imperialism, this new generation of Marxist-Leninists and Maoists derive their politics from largely imagined set of geopolitical configurations, eschewing even the logic of an enemy of my enemy is my friend. These would-be Marxists had convinced themselves that any enemy of the US is a socialist utopia, perhaps even a global anti-imperialist power. This has led them to support the modern Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, looking to as a model of international socialism and anti-imperialism, the last bulwark of 20th century communism against the ever-expanding American empire. What this generation of Marxists has ignored is China's late Cold War role as the great anti-communist power in the East, and a subsequent role in financing the American empire as it invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. The story of this transition from international vanguard of the communist movement to key American Cold War ally and member of the World Trade Organization is key to understand the structure and maintenance of the modern capitalist system. Without this perspective, would be leftists are left to wade through a reality composed of half-remembered slogans and the symbol of a world that died a half a century ago. Unable to see the actual structures of capital in the empire that composed the American imperial system between the US and the People's Republic of China were not always friendly, although American opposition to communism is based somewhat as the product of the allegiance of the Soviet Union, the USSR, and during the Second World War. The Truman administration backed Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists against the CCP in the Chinese Civil War. The resulting loss of China as communist victory in the Civil War was understood in the US to be a major driver of McCarthyan anti-communist politics. Almost immediately after the end of the Civil War, China and the US faced off again over the US intervention in Korea. The war will see Chinese troops make bayonet charges through their own artillery against entrenched American positions as the two nations went to war over the fate of the peninsula. A mere 30 years later, the American-backed PRC would invade the newly minted socialist state in Vietnam with the goal of crushing Soviet influence in East Asia. How can we account for this rapid geopolitical shift? The answer lies on two crises that the CCP faced in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The geopolitical crisis of the Soviet split and a related domestic Chinese production crisis that spanned the majority of the socialist period. A key moment in both the crisis that would drive China into the American camp was the USSR deindustrialization of the Manchurian industrial belt. This belt, developed by the Japanese during its occupation of Manchuria, was hauled by train to the other side of Russia at the end of World War II to rebuild the Soviet manufacturing base against the pleas of the Chinese communists, leaving the ancient Chinese state less industrial than the Russia had been in 1917, and fomenting political and economic tension between the PRC and the USSR. At every step of China's path, from communist stalwart to key ally of the American empire, interstate competition between nominally socialist governments will only strengthen capitalism. The final product of this disastrous strategy is the endless parade of horrors, from capitalist plagues to concentration camps to the endless cycle of famine and war we confront today. China's complicity in these horrors teaches us that anti-capitalism is a class war, not a war between states, and that any attempt to confront imperialism, the great spawn of capitalism, by those same means is doomed to fail. Understanding China's role in American empire reminds us how urgently we must confront the capitalist world system in its entirety. The Sino-Soviet tensions, the CCP's relation with the USSR was fragile from the start. Soviet-imposed leadership from the Third International pushed the CCP into the disastrous alliance with the nationalists, to culminate the nationalist slaughtering of the communist workers of the 1927 Shanghai Uprising and essentially destroying the urban wing of the CCP. The relation worsened dramatically over the Khrushchev's secret speech at the USSR moved to pull out its advisors and technicians as a protest against the Great Leap Forward. The souring of relations further intensified China's economic production bottleneck, a crisis that arose the product of the devastation both World War II and the Chinese Civil War wrought in Chinese agriculture. In order to increase the agricultural output, the CCP needed the industrial capacity to modernize Chinese agriculture with technology such as tractors. But in order to build that industrial capacity, the CCP also needed to expand Chinese food supply to support a larger band population to do industrial work. This created a bottleneck in production which inhibited further development. In 1952, the CCP attempted to simplify blow through the bottleneck using the sheer force of its rural workers. The Great Leap Forward pulled agricultural workers out of the field to focus on infrastructure projects and attempt to make up for the labor shortfall created by taking workers out of the field. The result was an epical disaster. The famine that followed killed millions without making a dent in the bottleneck, which sharply increased the urgency to build industrial capacity. The Sino-Soviet relations continued to deteriorate in the 1960s war on. In 1969, open conflict between Chinese and Soviet troops broke out in the Zhenbao island, where nearly caused a war between the two countries and saw division of the Chinese and Soviet army mobilized across the entirety of the border. This border conflict finally caused the decisive break between China and the USSR. Mao's solution to this problem was to begin negotiation with the US to both build an anti-Soviet alliance and gain access to American technology. Those technology transfers were vital to the future Chinese economy. Import substitute schemes like the one that the CPC was about to attempt largely failed, as was the case of Venezuela and the Andean Pact in the 1970s, because the multinational company refused to sell country to the technology needed to create domestic industrial competitors. The US, however, was willing to ship China entire factories as technology transfer, but for a different kind of price. The CCP would sell out the global communist movement. China's realignment toward American capitalism. The first sign of the betrayal was China's active role in supporting Pakistan during the 1971 genocide in Bangladesh. By 1972, Mao's meeting with Richard Nixon signaled that the full anti-communist pivot was complete. With this pivot, China became a close American ally and the bulwark on anti-communism in East Asia and beyond. By the middle of the decade, the CCP was giving out loans to Pinochet, supporting UNITA in Angola alongside South Africa and the US against Cuba and Soviet Union, and had opened diplomatic relations with reactionary capitalist powers from the Marcos regime in the Philippines to Japan. Deng Xiaoping sealed this alliance by invading Vietnam in 1979 in defense of the US-backed Khmer Rouge, with the Vietnamese government having attempted to overthrow. The CCP claimed to have killed 100,000 Vietnamese communists in the war, which broke the back of the communist movement in East Asia and essentially ended it as a Cold War front, thus allowing the US to fully pivot to its massacres in Latin America and Africa, in addition to the defense of Europe against the USSR and domestic communist movement. China continued to back anti-communist movement across the globe for the rest of the Cold War. By then, the Cold War was nearly over. Communist movement betrayed by its owners sent into in several tailspin, ended in the fall of the USSR and the total victory of the American capitalism. China's realignment towards the capitalist bloc are solved another problem of the US declining rate of the profit during the crisis of the 1970s, causing massive unprofitable overcapacity in the manufacturing sector, matched by the capital that was impossible to profitably invest. This crisis manifested itself in the series of debt bubbles that drenched from Latin America to Japan. However, integrated China's highly educated but extremely poor population into the global economy as both a source of labor as a market, restored manufacturing long enough for capitalism to weather the storm. Capital began to flow into Chinese industries, as a project with intensified through East Asia bubble collapsed in the 1990s. American military logistics line that once contained the threat of Chinese communism were fully converted into servicing Chinese export to the US through the advent of container shipping. It was during this period that China's military alliance with the American Empire transformed fully into economic alliance. American Empire is built on debt. Its financial and military power are inseparable. America's deficient spending pays for the American army, which in turn is used to extract tribute for the form of forcing other countries to pay American debt that can never nor will ever be repaid. It is through this arrangement, debt purchasing at gunpoint, that the American empire is maintained, but despite the posturing of American and Chinese officials backed by an armed industry, the US cannot military coerce China, which boasted both nuclear weapons and the world's largest army. This makes China's role in the American empire entirely unique. Unlike other major American pawn purchasers like Japan, South Korea, and Germany, who are American military protectorates and can thus even be coerced into increasing the value of their currency, China subsidies the American war machine because it wants to. More precisely, the CCP funds American wars into maintaining the highly valued dollar relevant to the yuan, which gives China a massive competitive edge in manufacturing is a critical source of China's massive economic outgrowth, but the cost to the rest of the world is enormous. Although China clearly did not force the US to invade Iraq, it did fund the war, a coalition with East Asian American military protectorates. China filled the massive budget shortfall that resulted from the combination of the Iraq War, the Bush-era tax cuts, and the early 2000 recession, propping up the failing US economy as the war commenced. Chinese pawn purchases intensified the US spending in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Indeed, the CCP became an eager participant in the war on terror by allying closely with Israel, adopting American counterinsurgency techniques and technologies, from rapidly bordering trade, and eventually hiring American mercenaries at the Eric Prince from themselves to deployment in Xinjiang. China is complicit in and in some way responsible for American imperialism. The CCP picked the side of capital in the Cold War, doomed the international communist movement in the process, and continue to fund American imperialism to this day. But the simple claim that both states are bad is to miss the point. Imperialism in its modern form is a product of capitalism. Capitalism is a world system, not merely a product of decisions of individual countries. Replacing one capitalist empire with another is futile. Any form of anti-imperialist politics that focus on nations inevitably arise and putting one of the faces of capitalism against the other, which can only ever produce the very system it claims to fight. Only through a confrontation with the entire capitalist world system, no matter the color of its flag, can the nightmare of the empire truly end.